pleased to welcome you to this program, one of many in the season, upcoming season. We have a very exciting program this afternoon, and I'm going to in a minute introduce Jonathan Massey, who will introduce our speaker. But I want to take a minute because I know not everyone here is acquainted with Library Associates, and it won't be a long commercial message. But there is a brochure in the back that tells a little bit about it. But I want to tell you a little bit about the benefits of membership, and I'll be very quick. Here are some of the benefits for you to become a member of Library Associates. Invitations to Library Associates lectures and events, free event parking one block from Byrd Library, invitations to member receptions after lectures, access to library facilities and collections, borrowing privileges at the right level, if you're at the patron level or higher, every issue of the Courant, which is our special collections newsletter, an invitation to our holiday reception, a discount on our spring luncheon tickets, and last but not least, opportunities to volunteer both on the campus and in the community. And for that, you can get away for very little expense, become a member, and help us support, among other things, the library, the special collections, and we have this historic. We're historic. We go back to Chancellor Tolley in its founding, and so we have a historic legacy. But the important thing about Library Associates to me is that there are people still that believe in the book and the printed word and want to honor it, not revere it necessarily, but honor it and keep it going. And so your contribution can help us, help the library, and do something good for future generations. So thank you, and with that I want to introduce Jonathan Massey, who's chair of the Bachelor of Architecture program at the Steam School of Architecture at Syracuse University, who will introduce our speaker today. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan.
There's always a danger with these nested introductions that by the time we actually give you Russell King, you'll be looking at your watch and ready to go. So I'll try to keep things short and sweet. There are not many architecture firms operating in the United States today that can trace their history back to 1868, as you can well imagine. And it's really a remarkable testament to the quality and the organization and the kind of esprit de corps of the King family that they have maintained that practice and built it in ways that have responded to the opportunities and challenges of each new generation and each new era. And I think of King & King in the same terms as we think of Crouse-Hinds or Carrier Corporation or Syracuse University itself as part of the legacy of expertise that has been built up at different moments in the history of central New York. And I attended a lecture last year by the sociologist Saskia Sassen, who is an expert at Columbia University on globalization, and especially on how cities and regions are transforming in response to the new, again, opportunities and challenges of changing times. And she talked a little bit about the way centers of manufacturing and industrial production, like Syracuse, built up huge investments in fixed capital, in factories and canals and highways and railroads and all the facilities that it took to become a center of manufacturing production. And that it's all too often that we think those industries are dwindling, and we need to get in on a new global economy which is somehow located elsewhere. Her key argument was, in fact, Syracuse and other cities like it are already participating in the global economy. We just need to figure out how, and especially to figure out what sets of skills and expertise are were built up in the manufacturing economy that now have relevance somewhere else. And I thought this was an especially lucid analysis because just a few days before, on a flight up from New York, I had been seated next to a young engineer from Dubai who was coming to Syracuse to get trained on how to operate the switching equipment that his company used in oil fields in the Persian Gulf. And he said, yes, all of our equipment is made by Crouse-Hinds. It comes from Syracuse. And we send people regularly to central New York to get trained for our booming oil economy in the Persian Gulf. And so I thought that was a perfect kind of confluence of anecdote and analysis that suggested that in fact Syracuse, that reminded me of all the different sets of knowledge, experience, capability, and expertise that are vested in the city and its region, and that are participating in broader circuits of capital and of innovation. And Syracuse has not often been at the top of lists of architectural innovation, but our very strongest legacy here is the firm of King & King, which, like those other larger institutions and like the university itself, has really built up an expertise that today is concentrated on medical and healthcare facilities, hospitals, and other healthcare buildings, in educational facilities, K through 12, but also in higher education. And in fact, we could say that King & King and Syracuse University have kind of shaped each other reciprocally over the you don't often get to say this, over the centuries, over the many decades, nearly, well, let's say more than 150 years, or coming up on 150 years of collaboration. When we look at the list of buildings that King & King has contributed to the campus, we could start with Tully Hall and Krause College, but it goes right up through the latest building projects and includes especially a lot of post-World War II work, like Byrd Library, probably the most prominent of those post-war commissions, but including also H.B. Krause Hall, the Biological Research Building, the Physics Building, the Belfer Audio Archive, the Heroy Geology Library, and Link Hall, just to mention the projects that Russell King, our speaker tonight, was directly affiliated with. King & King has also been a firm that has helped other architects build here in Syracuse, such as their work with IMPE on the first Newhouse building. And so it's almost impossible, I think, for us to picture Syracuse University without the work of King & King shaping our vision, because the campus that we know today is so largely a product of their work. And likewise, I'm sure that reciprocally the commissions from and the support of and the educational inputs of the university into this family history, this architectural dynasty, are not insignificant either. And it was the chance to do projects at Syracuse that helped them become, statewide experts and prominent designers of buildings in education and healthcare. So that's sort of, I guess, what comes to mind when I think about this illustrious firm. Russell King, as you may know, graduated from Syracuse University in 1952, and after a stint in the Navy has worked here in his family's firm since, I guess, 1956 or 7, and has played such a great role in shaping the campus, and probably the building of his that means the most to us this evening is the one we're standing in, Byrd Library, the intellectual hub of the campus, for sure. And now, according to the food service people I talked to, the coffee hub as well. So thank you very much, and I introduce Russell King.
I think you just gave my thought probably better than I could do it. But thank you very much for that introduction. It was great. It traced a lot of interesting history that we have with the university. We're very proud of our work here. If I had a lot more courage than I do, I'd probably do this whole presentation from the podium using PowerPoint. But because of my advancing age and little knowledge of PowerPoint itself, I'm going to do it like the old days, except that I did bow to the computer to keep my crib notes. So with that, I'll begin. Title of the talk today is Designing the Bird, An Architect's Tale. And we had a lot of fun trying to decide how how to title this thing, because I don't know, it was 8 or 9 months ago, or maybe almost a year, that Harvey Kaiser asked me to do this, and I said I would, but I didn't really know what I was going to do. And Mary Beth asked me, well, how are we going to title this? And I gave her a few titles. I said, I want to keep it cryptic enough so that I can talk about whatever I decide to when I get there. And she finally suggested this, and I think it fits very well. An architect's tale. Well, if you look up tale in the dictionary, you might find it could be a story, or it could be a story. And I hope this is a story, my memory of what happened during the process of getting this great building together. Before I go further, I'd like to acknowledge a couple of people. Mary Beth Hinton over here, who was so great in helping to point me in the right direction to find the materials that I needed, because my memory is failing. And Kathleen White, of course, for making the arrangements here today. Mary O'Brien in the archives, who after the dean told me that there was a model, I went and looked at it and I said, by gosh, we made it. And would we like to use it? So here it is. And John Green's The Tolley Years, and also the preceding part of the history of the university. Probably the least reliable, well, also I should acknowledge Jen Wells, who's not here, but who was here earlier, part of the King and King staff, who helped me with all of this, and Lisa Maynard, who is here. And they're probably the least reliable of all of the things that I used to put this together in my memory. So if I make a mistake, and I may, you'll forgive me in advance. Besides which, we've got quite a few of our friends and relatives here, so if there's any kind of an uprising, I think we have a pretty good chance at it. As I started to think about this, it was a long time ago, and I mentioned my memory. It was 51 years ago, as a matter of fact, 1957, when I first took part in what was to become the Byrd Library. I was 28 years old. But as I thought further about the library, I thought, you know, King and King has a unique history, which was mentioned, and it's sort of parallel to the universities. The firm that was to become King and King was founded in 1868 by Archimedes Russell. Syracuse University was founded in 1870, so we beat you. But also another interesting fact was that Archimedes Russell designed 3 out of the first 4 buildings on the campus. And King and King is very proud of that heritage. And the beat goes on. And I'd like to acknowledge some of the people that are here. Sarah Ioli is our Director of New Business Development. Lisa Maynard is one of her great helpers. And we've got even, hopefully, the 5th generation here, Alex King, sitting next to his dad. That's the kid with the hair. He's a junior in the School of Architecture, and someday he may be part of this whole thing. Pete King is one of the partners next to Alex. Jim King also, and if those 2 guys look alike, it's because they're twins. Bob Secor, not to be forgotten, was a partner in the firm along with me for many years. He and I, both retired, carry the title of consulting partner. Now what does that mean? Anybody ask you anything recently? Me too. But that's a great title, but it's in lieu of responsibility and salary. Bob headed our design team for almost 30 years and had a lot to do with some of the buildings that you see up here, and including this one. Going back to history, Archimedes Russell was born in Massachusetts in 1840, and he lived until 1916 when he died. He came here in probably about 1865 or 6, following the Civil War, and was apprenticed to Horatio White. He was also 28 years old when he opened his own firm in 1868. He designed a couple of buildings that are notable at Cornell, McGraw Hall and Sibley Hall, which were built in the early 1870s, but most notably for this tale, he designed 3 out of the first 4 buildings, including the Holden Observatory, which is a little building that was moved a few years ago, and the first library, the Von Rank Library, and also the Krause College for Women, which had been mentioned earlier. Now you'd think the Von Rank Library, which is now the Tolley Building, was probably named after the donor, but that isn't the case. It was named after the collection that was brought from Germany to be housed in that building, and it was said that part of the requirements for obtaining that collection, and there's a whole story that goes behind that, as some of you know, that the building had to be as fireproof as possible, including iron pipe bookcases and an iron stairway, and that's what was said about that building. Archimedes also taught at the School of Architecture between 1873 and 1881, and it was a volunteer position at that time. One of our partners now, Kirk Narberg, is also teaching in the School of Architecture. In fact, he was here a few minutes ago, and I said, Kirk, can't you cut class and come down and listen to this thing? And he said, I dare not do that. So, thanks, Ed. And the School of Architecture at that time was one of only 3 in the country. Most architects at that time apprenticed to some other architect, and that's how they learned their profession. So where did the king and king come in? That was my grandfather was the first king in the business. He came, he was from Lafayette. The story was that he used to walk in once a week, and he worked for Archimedes Russell as an apprentice. And after 6 months, I think Archimedes said, Mel, how long have you been here? And he said, 6 months. He said, well, don't you think we ought to start paying you? And he thought that was a good idea. But in those days, he shoveled the coal into the furnace, and he took out the ashes, and he swept the floors and sharpened pencils. But that's how the business, the profession was learned in those days. My grandfather was made a partner in 1906 as a result of his being what today we would call the project architect on the Onondaga County Courthouse, which is down in downtown Syracuse. Most of you are familiar with that. It's about 100 years old. So and they're just putting a new domed roof on it. Manny knows all about that. My dad, who was also a Syracuse grad, came into the firm in 1924 following graduation, made a partner in 1930. And one of the stories he told me, and I'll never forget it, it's embedded in my mind, is that in 1933, at the depths of the Depression, I hope we aren't heading for something like that now, the gross receipts in the office were $300. $300. Well, that might be like $3,000 today, but still, it wasn't much money. And the only people in the firm were my dad and my grandfather, and they just sat around, played cards, and answered the phone. But that was following, in 1933, Prohibition had ended, and that's when the Hotel Syracuse decided to reconstitute their bar, the Rainbow Lounge, and that was the commission that brought in the $300. So this is kind of an interesting history of the firm, and very brief. Let's fast forward to the Tolley years, which is where this library, Chancellor Tolley was the driver for this building. He came to the university in 1942. He was the youngest college president, I believe, in the country. And when he retired in 1969, he was the longest tenured president. Little known facts that might come up on a test someday. Tolley's legacy was substantial in this community and, of course, at the university. He was one of a few giants, it was said. I can't tell you who said it, but somebody said it in this area. And he truly was highly respected, not only at the university. I'm sure there were some people that didn't like him, but he was quite a guy. In 1943, World War II was on. Tolley chaired the post-war planning commission for Syracuse and Onondaga County, and I think that people respected his vision, and he was a visionary. And at that time, he revealed his vision of what Syracuse University was to become, which was a major research university. He estimated at the time that 20 to 30 buildings would be required to bring it to that point where it would serve as this research university. He was just about correct. I think there were more than, probably about 30 buildings built. We did maybe 20 of them, which was a great thing. But how did we get involved in all of this? Tolley was quite a remarkable guy to me. He was a visionary. He often said, make no small plans. During 1943-45, he recognized that he needed a lot of land to complete his vision. He was a land baron. He added nearly 1,000 acres of property to the university's holdings, including much of it around this area, old houses and whatever he could buy, he bought. I'm not sure how he financed it, but he was good with money. In 1943, during the war, the draft age was lowered from 21 to 18. It took about almost half of the enrollment out of the university at the time. It went from 3,800, which it had been prior to the war, or it went from 6,000 prior to the war down to 3,000, or 3,800. So he added military units and military education, which was somewhat controversial, but it helped to pay the bills. As the war went on, the GI Bill was put into place in 1946, and we had what was referred to as the GI bulge. In 1946, the enrollment had swelled to 15,000. By the next year, it was 18,000. The need for space was huge. He owned a lot of our university owned a lot of the cottages. They were converted to dormitories. They bought other buildings that were converted to dormitories. For housing, some of the students initially were housed at the State Fair and some of the animal buildings, actually in the horse pens. There were buildings at the State Fair that were used, Thompson Road, the Carrier Plant, and Baldwinsville, and all over the place. There were blue buses running all around the city, and this is how how it was in those days. And I happened to be in school about that time, so I know that the enrollment was huge. There were all these older guys that were back from the service. I was an 18-year-old apple-cheeked youth at the time. But the chancellor, recognizing the need for space, it said that he bought 700 war surplus prefabricated buildings for $1 a piece. Not a bad deal. Somewhere else I read that it was only 300. So there might be a discrepancy there, but nonetheless, there were a lot of buildings to get in place. And so that's where King & King came into play. We were called upon with a team of engineers, landscape architects, and planners to get these buildings in place so that they could be used, getting heat in them, getting the foundations done, the roads and the parking and the plumbing and so forth. There wasn't much architecture to it, but it was war work, as Gordon Smith, one of a retired industrialist who had been made a vice president at the university, said. It was fast and furious, and I guess it was. The only interesting architecture, which unfortunately is now gone, or maybe fortunately it's gone, was the Quonsetteria. Some of you might be old enough to remember it. It was two huge Quonset huts. I tried to find out how big they were, but they were monstrous. And connected with a dining, with a kitchen and food service facility. It served about 500 people at a sitting, and there were a lot of sittings. It was built out on the site where Manley Fieldhouse is now, along with that whole area at Manley was covered with temporary buildings. So that's how we got our feet wet at Syracuse. We became the associate architect to Lorimer Rich and Robbins Kahn in 1948 when some of the new buildings in Tolley's vision were being conceived. The Women's Building, the Law College, Shaw Dormitory, Haft, and several other buildings. Rich was from, and his partners were from New York City. Their famous building that put them on the map was the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier that was built after World War I in New York City. Rich had a great reputation. But by the mid-50s, his role became somewhat diminished. And the chancellor's impatience, I think, contributed to this. And Rich was a very contemplative style, had a contemplative style. Well, let's just say that schedules and budgets and timely decisions weren't his bag. He needed to think more about it. Rich was not fired, but according to some of the material that I've read, he was substantially blistered by several letters from the chancellor decrying his lack of movement on these projects. Chancellor was not one to be delayed. And it sort of just morphed into King, and Rich sort of switched roles. We became the architect, he was the associate, and soon Rich just seemed to fade out of the picture. He was never fired, he wasn't terminated, but it just so happened that he faded away, like all good soldiers maybe. So we became the architect for the university, and we were called on daily. We had to renovate a cottage over here for an ornithology professor who had been hired and was coming to the university, needed a laboratory. We had to fix a loading dock on the back of Bound Hall. We had to create a laboratory in one of the other buildings for a professor that had just been hired. We did everything. We actually became, by 1956, we were an arm of the university. Clark Alberg, who was one of the vice presidents, a guy that we worked with very closely at the time, said, you know, we should be paying you guys for some of this stuff. Some of it was so small, I mean, it would take more time to create a bill than it was to do the job. So we did a lot of things gratis. But we agreed we should be paid. And I guess we were. We did everything. We were the design and construction department until Harvey Kaiser so ably established one, a real one, in 1972. Harvey reminded me of the date, about the time this building was being completed. Now enter Mrs. Carnegie, and that's what we're here to talk about, is the library. Not the Carnegie Library, but Mrs. Carnegie, the myth. It was 1957. Harry, Chancellor, called my dad and said, I need a plan, a picture, and a model for the new library. What new library? For Mrs. Carnegie, obviously a potential donor. We knew there was a library in the offing, but this was the first call. So this is where it all began, 1957, with the Chancellor's call. So the Chancellor articulated his vision of what the library should be, along with Wayne Yenawine, who was then not only the Dean of Library Science, but also was the head librarian. And it seemed like almost overnight we created it. Not this model and not this plan, but a model and a plan on a site, which was the opposite, as I remember, it was opposite Sims Hall, on that block that was full of fraternity houses, now houses the Case Center and other science buildings. It was not the real site, and it seemed like it was done overnight. Probably took us a couple of weeks, but it was, I think Chancellor Tolley realized he was giving us an impossible assignment, but we also knew at the same time that he expected us to do it. So we did. And by the way, we never found out who Mrs. Carnegie was. I never met her, and I don't even know whether she existed or not. But in 1960, by 1960, and then there was some activity in the interim period on the library, but not much. The Chancellor was anxious to get started. He didn't have a donor, he didn't have the financing in place, but he understood that lead time, that we couldn't design this building and get it built overnight. So he asked us to get started on the library. We actually assigned it a job number, just tattooed on my arm, 60-124. But it didn't have a name. Was it about to happen? I know it was, but at the time, we weren't too sure. So the programming, that is, getting the requirements from the librarian and the library staff began. And it was excruciating. We sat in meetings and listened. And this one would talk, and that one would talk, and the head librarian would talk, and then this one would talk. And there was absolutely no leadership. With all due respect to Wayne, who was a great guy. It was so democratic that if you had an idea and you had an idea, well, they were ideas and nobody questioned them. So we listened and listened and listened and listened. And we got nowhere. So there was a hiatus in the planning, but the Chancellor and Vice Chancellor Peace Corps and other administrators were anxious, and they said, why don't you people, you architects, engineers, and library people, we want you to see the best libraries that there is in the country. So that meant travel coast to coast, and travel we did. We went to Harvard and MIT, Cornell, I'm not sure why we went to Cornell, Notre Dame, Washington at St. Louis, UCLA, Stanford, Wayne State in Detroit, University of Oregon, Washington at St. Louis, and there probably was others, but that's all I could remember. We got great information. We traveled as architects looking at the architecture and the planning that was done. The library staff was looking at the technical issues of how the library would function. So we were both getting excellent information. We would see things that they didn't, they would see things that we didn't. But that's a great way to research with your client. And we did this often. So we had all this great information. The staff was motivated and ready to go. When we got back, started our committee meetings, and started listening again, and listening, and listening, trying to inject some ideas. Nothing was happening. It was just like we'd started over again. And we said the only way, we said to ourselves, the only way we're going to get a program is we're going to write it. We know what's needed. We have a pretty good idea of what this program ought to be. We'll write it. So we wrote the program. And it wasn't perfect. Well, we didn't expect that it was. Nothing the first time you do it, and on paper, my grandfather says, you all make all your mistakes on paper. So we submitted the program to the library. Wow, yes. This, well, how about this and how about that? Well, there were adjustments made in the program, and finally we got some agreement. But this was the only way we could get it. We laid something in front of them, and they critiqued it. We made the changes, just the way you do in an architectural design process. So we finally had our program, and we knew that there were 3 million items to be included, 1.5 million books and 1.5 million other items, 2,500 reader stations, and it yielded a plan of about 300,000 square feet, which is a big building, and you're in it, and you know that it's big. Now, looking at the university master plan, where was this building to go? Actually, by this time we had a site, but let me tell you the story. There was a 5-block area between, bounded by University Place, Walnut Avenue, Waverly, and Irving Avenue. A big 5-block area, and it was to be, according to the master plan, which I think we helped to create, high-density academic center. And so we looked at this area, and actually, I had forgotten this, but there were actually 3 buildings that were going to be the library. The centerpiece was this building, which was going to contain principally graduate and research facilities and some of the undergraduate collections. Phase 2 and 3 were a building to the east, which is over where the Belfer building is, on top of a 500-car parking garage, which may or may never be completed or done. And at the west, there was the college library, which was to be connected to the student union. So that was the general plan. But Byrd was in that plan was to remain as Upper Division Research Library. But as it happened, you know that all of those functions ended up in this building. So we now had a site. We had selected this site because of its proximity to the campus and its being central to this high-density development. And as the university moved north, it became more central. And so it was a sort of a keystone in the whole campus plan. So finally, the chancellor announced that we have a site. He announced that the building size was about 300,000 square feet. The estimate was 9.8 million, and it was this site. That sounds pretty simple. We should be able to get started immediately. However, it turns out that this site is a city park. It's at the end of Walnut Park. If you're familiar with this area, you realize that Walnut Park used to extend all the way to University Place. There was a little glitch in in obtaining this land, while the city was willing to give it or sell it to the university, there was a reversionary clause in the contract when the Comstock family, I think, donated this land to the university, said that if the site ceased to be used as a city park, then it reverted back to the Comstocks and the family. But Chancellor Tolley was pretty good with negotiating with people and cajoling, and he and some good law work got it done. Got the heirs had no objection, and I'm sure that was due to Tolley's spirit and discussion. So we did have a site, in fact. The land swap was proposed with the city to give them an equal amount of land down at the north end of the Walnut Park. But as far as I know, the land swap never happened. And I hope there's nobody here from the city that'll try to dredge up that agreement. Also, Mr. and Mrs. Bird were on board and had made their agreement to finance a big chunk of this library. Maybe Mrs. Bird was Mrs. Carnegie. We never knew that. The Chancellor announced the gift at $3 million. So now we have a donor. Our job number, 60-124, I hope that doesn't bore you too much, has a name, Ernest Stevenson Bird Library. And it's 1967. The Chancellor announced a gift of $3 million. Actually, it was about $2.8 million. And when Mr. Bird read the announcement, I thought he might be mad, but actually he came up with the difference. So he did contribute the $3 million. It was the largest alumni gift up to that point. So now we're 10 years into the project. The game is on. We've got a program, a preliminary design, a site, and donor. And final design is ready to proceed. But the design board. The design board was created in the early 50s because the university recognized that there was a lot of building to be done to create Tolley's dream of a national research university. And it was decided by the trustees that there ought to be a special committee to oversee those designs. And so the design board was created about 1953, and that wasn't just for this project, it was for all projects. All projects that we or anybody else did had to go before the design board. And so they were charged with reviewing and approving. Tolley really enjoyed the design board process. One of the vice presidents said the design board was a recreation outlet for the chancellor. When I look back, I read that recently, and I looked back, and I think that was true. He enjoyed all of the interchange. He knew exactly what was going on this university and in the community all the time. He was kind of like a dean of students. He walked around, he knew everybody, he had an amazing capacity for detail. And so after one particular contentious meeting, and I think Bob and I were there, it was pretty obvious we were kind of disgruntled by some of one of the board members' comments. And he kind of continually gave us a hard time. He had some architectural background, and he would say, well, I think it needs more study. This needs more study, or that needs more study. And we weren't getting anywhere. So the chancellor came up to us as everybody kind of filed out, and we were picking up our stuff. And he said to Bob and I don't know if my dad was there or not, he said, now listen, don't let what's-his-name get you ruffled. He said, some votes count more than others. Mine. He didn't really say mine, but we knew. So we finally got our approval. There's one other story I'll tell you about Tolley. It's totally unrelated to this building, but it has something to do with the university. We were working on a project which shall remain nameless, and a dean who shall remain nameless. And we always took the projects up to the chancellor's office and sat around, and he looked at what we were doing. On this particular project, he spotted something right away that wasn't right. We knew it, and he picked it up immediately. He said, what are you doing that for? I said, well, Chancellor, the dean wants it that way. He said, don't pay any attention to that guy, he's a nut. Do it right. He was pretty frank with us, and he was quite a guy. The next 12 months or so were full of activity. We were off and running, final design, and there were federal funding, there was utilities to get out of the way. We were developing the final design, the site plan. There was also a chilled water plant being designed at the same time, not only for this building, this was going to be the first building on it, but for a big portion of the campus. Sometimes the cost of that is kind of lumped into the library. Unfairly, I think, but nonetheless, that's the way it's written in some of the literature. So we were off and running, and bids were taken in June 1969. Another number that's tattooed on my other arm was $11,689,000. That was the bids, as I recall. Construction was relatively routine. This is a big building. It had some complicated things in it, but it went along quite well. Building, as I remember, was opened in September 1972, and although I was confused and I went back and looked at my own records, that we dedicated in April 1973, but I found out that both of those dates are correct. So the final cost of the library was about $12.5 million after furniture and fees and so forth, for about 300,000 square feet, $42 a square foot. The cost today, I don't know, $70, $80 million maybe. I have a hard time dealing with those numbers. I thought $11 million or $12 million was a lot of money, but it's hard for me to understand the numbers that our firm deals with today. The sidebar, I think this was the first building that we actually had a written American Institute of Architects contract. And the reason we had that was because of the federal funding. They said, you know, we needed to see the contract. Well, the building was about half finished. So, or maybe it was just starting, but we wrote the contract. And previous to that time, it was a letter, exchange of letters and a handshake, and off we went. But the other buildings, you wouldn't do that today, and we didn't do it following that. We recognized the need for good contracts, good business practice. Talking a little bit about the design, and the reason I didn't use the podium, and the reason I didn't use the PowerPoint is because I like to move around a little bit. So I will talk a little bit about the design. The site plan, as I mentioned, the site was a focal point of the university. It is going to become a focal point of the university at this time, and as it turns out, it did. The model, after we're finished, if you're still awake, you can come up and take a look at the model. It really tells you about the site and how it worked. Before I go any further, I just want to mention Dr. Don Ely sitting here in the back. I told him I'd put him in this presentation, and I didn't tell him about it because I was afraid it would scare him off. But Don was the guru of what's coming next. What is information retrieval? What is electronic communications? What did we know at that time? Don worked with us on almost every building we did to help us anticipate what the needs were going to be in the future. The site sloped from the University Place side down to Waverly, which gave us an opportunity to get entrances at 2 levels. Now we wanted this building to sit on a flat site, so we flattened the site so that we could have a plaza all the way around it. And one of the things about a library, for those of you that work in a library this size, you know that the service to this building, or to a building like this, is very heavy. In this case, probably the heaviest service on the campus, with the exception of, say, food service. The mail and the books and the periodicals and stuff that comes in, it's processed and goes out to the other parts of the library system on the campus is huge. So the processing area, technical services area of the library is a big one, and there's a lot of movement of goods and services. We didn't want a back door. none of the research that we did at any of the other libraries around the country had really solved that very well. UCLA probably came the closest. They recognized it, and they had a subgrade tunnel out to a parking lot, but the tunnel itself impeded traffic around the building. So, but it gave us an idea that maybe we could do something and we could not have a back door. And I think there's a lot of people who don't know where the back door is. Because if you walk around the building, it all looks, you know, there's no loading docks, no dumpster. But down below in the technical processing area, there's a tunnel. And it goes through under the plaza and comes up in a little building over on the side, which contains an elevator and a loading dock and all the stuff that goes in the loading dock, where stuff comes in and goes into the processing area and then comes back out again. So that's how we solved that problem, and I think it worked at the time. I don't know, Dean, does it still work?
Yes, the answer is yes.
Yes.
Okay, that's the answer, yes, that's what you're supposed to say. So going further, the building plan, of which you can't see up here, but which I can tell you a little bit about. Building itself is very symmetrical. It's square. It's approximately the same on all four sides. Looking at the Waverly Avenue entrance, is here on the north, went into the big open area. These dots here are columns, and they're actually, there's one there, and there's one there, and over here, and over there. And that's a 26 by 26 foot module. And that's what really shaped the building, because it fit exactly the typical spacing of the book stacks. Other than that, none of the other elements really had a major effect on shaping the building, but that was sort of the beginning. That was the module that started the building off. And we continued that throughout. Everything else fit within that. The processing and periodical library, where it's at the lower level, I don't have that plan, but take my word for it, it's at the lower level, and that's part that connected to the tunnel. There was also a big reading room for the current periodicals. The processing at that time was computerized. Must have been pretty primitive by today's standards, but nonetheless there was a computer operation down there. Looking at the rendering here, this is the Waverly Avenue side, and the first two floors were the open sort of public floors, easily accessible, and I'm glad to see that they are now again easily accessible, because at one time they weren't. But the old building has adapted reasonably well. So the first two floors on the elevation here were open public floors that contained the reader services, the catalog, general reading space, and now a coffee shop. That didn't exist at the time because it was to be connected right directly to the student union. But at any rate, then going up in the upper floors, floors 3, 4, and 5 were identical in plan. And they were the stack floors. Again, our 26 by 26 foot module, the central elevator cores and services. And then on the 6th floor was the rare books and special collections area, with deeply set back. And it's saying to me that, you know, it's a different kind of space. It's special, and it is. Those of you that have been there recognize that. And topping off the building is this deep cornice, which sets the whole building, terminates the building, and unifies the whole composition. The stairs at the corners, at each corner, there's a vertical stairs and a shaftway for the mechanical, electrical equipment, and anticipating some of Don's future requirements. We thought there was going to be a lot of wires involved back in those days, and but we didn't want to add cost to the building to include those things. So we provided places where those wires and pipes could be threaded through at a later time. And as a matter of fact, during construction, the university decided that the building should be sprinklered. We sort of cringed at that. We're going to see all this sprinkler piping up, especially where the structure is exposed. But as it turned out, we had left chases through the beams, and the sprinkler pipes on those stack floors were simply threaded through those chases that we left, and now the sprinklers are set up within the structure. You can still see them, but they're not hanging down on pipe hangers and so forth. So it was fortuitous that we had thought about wires, and it ended up being sprinkler pipes, but it worked. Security and control were major issues in the library at that time, so that on the first floor, we entered here. On the upper floor, on the second floor, we entered here by a bridge, which has been removed, but I understand it's going to be reinstated. But there were major control points at those entrances to prevent any loss of books. There were alarmed exits. So if you went through an exit into one of the stairwells from an upper floor, theoretically a security person could catch you by the time you got out the bottom. And you were outdoors when you got outside. In fact, as you can see it on this, there's the exit door right there. A sidebar, and I talked about automation, information retrieval, Don Ely. It was in the late 60s, and I mentioned how did we accommodate it and what did we know at the time. But anticipation was the name of the game. Fact is, all of the buildings that we designed, the dormitories, as I remember, all had wireways placed in them, but we didn't want to add cost to do it. And I explained how that happened. Let me just put that. One of the questions that was asked, if you can believe it, during the design and even while we were dealing with Don and his anticipation of the needs for information retrieval, someone said, well, are we still going to have books in the library, or will it all be electronic media to be retrieved somehow into a study carrel? Don remembers some of that discussion. So it was a question. There was a lot of things we didn't know about the information age that was to come. The nuts and bolts of the building, it's a poured in place reinforced concrete. I mentioned the module that established the building, and it's expressed on the exterior with these columns here, which hold up this faceted screen, which provides an interesting place. And as a matter of fact, during the last month or so, when I was trying to put this together and refresh my memory about what this building was all about, I worked up in some of those stacked floors against the outside windows. And the deep fins and the small, varying size windows provide really a human scale to those big spaces. And it was a very pleasant experience for me to work there, quiet, and glimpses of the campus. Maybe you want to go back to school again. I think it's a little late for that, but it was fun being there, and it was fun doing the research and putting this together. The exterior is even the poured in place concrete on the exterior has been sandblasted, as have these columns. You can see the aggregate in the columns, and it's a pink granite. And the screen elements on these floors and the balusters here were precast concrete with a light wash exposed aggregate. So there you have it. The Byrd Library, designing the Byrd, an architect's tale. 16 years in the making. I was much younger when it started. I was much younger when it was finished. I'd be very happy to answer any questions as long as they're reasonable. Questions? Somebody's got to have a question. Don.
Where did the Byrd money come from?
Now you're really taxing my memory. I just read this, but short-term memory is worse than long-term memory. Bird was in charge of sales for some large company. Dean, do you remember the company? I don't, but he was, he may have had money in his family, but he retired. He was vice president in charge of sales for some major company, whose name escapes me.
That'd be your next one.
Yeah. My next. Yes.
How did you decide on poured concrete instead of like brick or something else?
Instead of what?
Brick or,
Oh,
some other.
well, that's sort of a story in itself. For in years past, after the war, the sort of the key building on the campus was the chapel, Hendricks Chapel, which was brick, red brick and limestone. And it was decided that by the university and the trustees that was to be the idiom of design throughout the campus. And it was until Newhouse. Chancellor came to us and said, I've got $1.5 million, we've got to design a journalism building. Well, $1.5 million didn't go, I mean, it was a lot more than it is today, but it didn't go very far to design what later became the journalism building. So, Mr. Newhouse brought Mr. Pei in. He was quite impressed with his work. And I.M. Pei, Bob will remember, one of the nicest guys you ever met. He wasn't a prima donna. He was a fantastic designer. And he was brought in, and lo and behold, through some negotiations, Mr. Newhouse came up with $15 million. That was just a few times more than what we had. And so the dean was asked, how did the chancellor get $15 million out of Mr. Newhouse? And his answer was something like this: Newhouse had it, he wanted it. But also, I think the $15 million was enough money that Mr. Pei and Mr. Newhouse were able to convince the university that they ought to break the mold. No more brick and limestone. Maybe Pei wanted to do this building, his building, Newhouse one in concrete. And there was quite a resistance to that in the design board. Bob will remember this. And so Mr. Pei came up with a design, the exact same design, in brick and limestone. And I wish I had a picture of it because it was kind of amusing. And he showed him how it would look in brick and limestone. It just didn't look, it's not the right thing to do. And so ultimately the $15 million got us off the brick and limestone for that building and several since. So that's part of the story. But structurally it made sense to use concrete. It's an interesting material. There's so much flexibility. Any form that you can build, you can fill with concrete. And so that's basically it. But structurally, it was good too because we had heavy loads. The structure was exposed in the upper 3 floors. And if you go up there, you'll see these concrete coffers, 4 feet by 4 feet, which also reflect the module of the stacks and the reader spaces. And also provide quite an interesting acoustical effect. It really soaks up the sound. Not that those floors are noisy, but I can remember in the physics building we used a similar system, and you could make quite a loud noise in the laboratory, and it was soaked up immediately with that coffered system. Long answer to a short question. Yes?
When you started the building, did you envisage that it might have to expand at some time? And if so, how was the expansion going?
Okay, yes, that's a good question. I think I mentioned that, but I didn't dwell on it. The original concept was that there would be another building here to the east that would be on top of a parking garage, and it would take the rare books and special collections. And then there was to be another building on the west which would become the college library and be connected to a student union. So that was the expansion. The other thing that I recall was Frank Peascore, who was the vice chancellor, said, I don't want any Yes.
A couple of things, that you guys never took into consideration the weight of the books, that's why we have a crack in the basement. And two, that this building was supposed to be bigger, like taller, but you ran out of money. Is that true?
Okay. The second part of your story is not true. It was never designed to be bigger. I think Dean Thorne asked me that same question a month or two ago. Wasn't it supposed to be higher? And I said, no, it wasn't. It was never designed for additional floors. And you're the lady that helped me in the research up in the archives room, as I remember. Yeah, it's a myth. It's an urban myth that we forgot the books. And you know, book stacks, 7 books per lineal foot, you know, times 10 shelves. It's pretty heavy stuff. So we did plan for the books. But the myth comes from the fact that during construction, our chief structural engineering consultant, was walking through the building, and he noticed a distinct pattern of very fine cracks near where the beams met the columns. And he knew right away that, you know, maybe there's a problem. So we looked into it. Harvey Kaiser will remember this well, and found that the shop drawings that had been created by the people who put the iron rods into the reinforcing concrete, they had left out some little pieces at the ends where these beams meet the columns. So now we had something in place, and we had to fix it. We couldn't take it apart to fix it. We had to fix it in place. So we engaged an engineer from Northbrook, Illinois, Mr. Elsner. How do I remember that?
Wisgender.
Yeah, yeah, Wisgen. Yeah, right. I didn't remember that part. Anyway, Dick Elsner came here. We looked at different ways to solve the problem. The building was going up, and we needed to fix it. We needed to do it rapidly. So we came up with a solution. We installed this in one bay, and then we brought in about 2 tractor-trailer loads of concrete block and double loaded. We put about twice as much load in the bay that was designed for, and it worked. So we continued around the building. Fortunately, we didn't really disrupt the construction because it was ongoing, and all of the rest of the stuff could be put in place, and we could do these fixes while the rest of the construction was going on. So that partly myth, but that's what really happened. We did plan for the books, but there were these little rods at the ends that had to be put in from the outside, essentially. Any others? That was a good question. I hope that nobody would ask. Harvey said he wouldn't ask it.
The students still,
They still,
they still say that's true.
yeah, well, it's not true. But we did have to do a little fix to make it complete. Yes, Dean?
Why did the design not include a formal reading room? I mean, I see reading room up there that I never saw, but an inspirational reading room. Do the librarians not want that?
They don't know the answer to that. There were the special seminar rooms on the 6th floor that you're aware of. But specifically a reading room. There was the 1916 room. Was that this room, or was that this room? But it was never part of the program, I guess. Anybody else? I have to acknowledge one guy that came in late, and I'm going to ding him for it. Dave Johnson, one of our partners, who stepped in late. Dave and I worked together on a lot of projects. And I tell you, I'm really proud of this firm. They more than doubled it since I left. It took that many people to replace me. Why is it everybody laughs? But the stuff that they're doing since Bob and I got out of there, and nobody asked us to consult, but what they're doing is amazing. They're moving the office from Manlius downtown. It's going to be a LEED certified platinum renovation in one of the ugliest buildings in town. But they're having fun at it, and they're doing lots of great stuff, and we've got the 5th generation, as I mentioned, coming along. So thank you very much. For more questions? Sure.
Just one other question. As the library is configured today, is it large enough to handle what it has to do?
My observation is no. I don't know whether the dean agrees or not, but having spent a few weeks up there looking at the stacks, a lot of them are more than 3/4 full. And I know that the whole system of access has changed. It's no longer the Dewey Decimal System, if it ever was, but whatever it was, it's now something different. And it's required some changes in the building, which have been made. And I assume the answer to that's no. I'm sure there's a lot more than 1.5 million volumes. Yes?
One quick question, how long did it actually take to physically build the?
Well, let's see, the bids were taken in June 1969, and the building was opened in 1972 in September, as I recall. Might have been completed earlier, but there was a big move between Carnegie Library and here. It was a monstrous project which we weren't involved with, thankfully. Anybody else? One more question. Uh-oh.
Russ, I was with one of your past clients, one of my current clients. Enjoyed it.
Okay. Well, King of King is, as my introducer said, is a great part at Syracuse University and a great part in this community. One of the sketches which I didn't show you was a drawing which I call King and King City. And the building's highlighted in yellow. And there's a lot of numbers on there, but they're not matched up with the building, so I apologize for that. But that was done, I think, in 1982, Bob, about then when we moved the office to Money Plaza. And it was designed to show all of the buildings that we had done in Syracuse and Onondaga County in one picture with 690 and 81 running through it, unfortunately, but that sort of identifies it. But you might be interested in looking at that. Anybody else? Thanks, Dave. That's the end of the story.
Excellent, thank you.